Hello BookTube, this is Weekly Reads. Earlier today I talked about the manga I read this week and has been the story for this year and last year and probably several years before that. The manga I've been reading has absolutely been the shining bright light of my reading. Everything else has disappointed me or has come to disappoint me, and this week is no exception. Everything else I read this week or attempted to read this week has been very disappointing, and it's disheartening, certainly. Of course, this week and the last few weeks have not been great outside of reading either for me. So let's get going. First up is City of Fortune by Roger Crowley. My plan was to read this book over the course of the last weekend. It's a history of Venice from its rise to prominence in the 9th or 10th centuries until its conquest by revolutionary France at the end of the 18th century. Unfortunately, as much as I want to read a history of Venice, I'm stymied by reading really, really annoying ones, I guess, or attempting to read really annoying ones. The prologue begins with a scene of Petrarch writing about Venetian ships leaving the city. And then the first chapter is this weird sort of how Venice rose to prominence, but there's no narrative continuation. The narrative leaps from location to location, from year to year, and it really annoyed me. So this book is a bail and will probably get put on the pile to eventually get rid of. Of course, as much as I say I'm going to remove books from my library, it is rather difficult to do because I don't really have reliable transportation or access to donating these books or taking them to the lone used bookstore here in Waco. Anyway, so after I bailed on City of Fortune on Friday, I decided on Saturday to read Brickmakers by Selva Almada, translated from the Spanish by McDermott. And surprise, surprise, I actually finished this book. Mind you, it's not that long, so it wasn't that difficult to finish. And there really wasn't anything that pissed me off enough to make me want to bail. The chapters are very short and punchy, and the plot is rather fast-paced, so there's not much of a slog. So, Brickmakers is about two young men, Marciano and Pajaro, who, over the course of the novel, are dying after a knife fight. And the narrative goes back to the feud between their fathers, Oscar and Elvio, and to what led up to this immediate fight. Pajaro's burgeoning relationship with Marciano's younger brother, Angel. And so part of the narrative is about Pajaro's father, Oscar, a little bit about Elvio and each's respective mothers, and then how the two young men were initially friends and then became enemies, and a little less about Pajaro and Angel. So with all of that, the novel does come off as being incredibly cluttered. And I think that makes things a little difficult. It's too busy. Especially, I think the focus on, I think to a certain extent, the focus might be more on the sort of lingering generational effects of toxic masculinity, which both this fathers and sons have in spades. The problem is that the father's influence on their sons, and particularly their sons' conflict, is negligible to a certain extent. Elvio dies 10 years before the novel takes place. And Oscar left the family the year after Elvio died. So, to what extent, maybe more attention could be paid to how exactly Marciano and Pajaro got into their conflict. Because what's presented in the novel isn't necessarily all that convincing. Particularly since one would think Marciano would have more conflict with Pajaro's new friend rather than with Pajaro himself. And then also, there is very little development of Pajaro's relationship with Angel. And Angel is very much a cipher, as is his twin sisters and however many extra siblings Pajaro has. I think there's 4 or 5 to my children. Anyway, so while as I was reading the novel, the snappiness of the chapters kept me going. I was also not satisfied with it. I was disappointed with it. And the more I think about it after having read it, the more I'm disappointed. And that's, I think, certainly true of my experience of Almada's work. I've also read Not a River, her more recent work, and that also very short and maybe a bit cluttered and also fairly disappointing. So, yeah. Now, my thought was to, over the course of the weekend, for Sunday, read another novel, but I decided instead to shift to Devotions by Mary Oliver. This is a collection of her poetry that came out a few years after her death, and collects her poems in reverse chronological order. Sometimes selected editions will start off with the more recent collections or new poetry, and then sort of descend to the earliest collections or earliest poetry at the end. And sometimes it's new poetry, and then it's the earliest poems, and then the most recent ones besides the new poetry. Anyway, I have to say, I don't like Mary Oliver's poetry all that much. There are some good ones, but for the most part, they just, I don't know, they just didn't work for me as much as I'd hoped they would. I don't know if it's just all of the subjects are roughly similar, if it's just that there's just something lacking in her work. And I thought maybe if I went to her earlier work, that would work, and it didn't. So, yeah. Now, that was a disappointment as well. And so on Monday, I tried Open Heaven by Sean Hewitt. This is his debut novel. Sean Hewitt is more well known as a poet, or at least his earlier work has been poetry. Whether or not this indicates he will, in addition to continuing to write poetry, will also write fiction, I don't know. So Open Heaven is about a man named James who is in his mid-30s, who, for whatever weird reason, is having a moment of nostalgia for his childhood, even though he absolutely hated his childhood or his teenage years when he was living it. So in the prologue, he is having all sorts of issues, probably because otherwise there would be no plot. And he decides to buy his childhood home, or an equivalent of his childhood home in his childhood village. And then the rest of the novel is mostly him remembering back to his first serious crush on another young man. I did not last long in this novel. It is very poetic, and that was fairly off-putting. Also, I'm not the biggest fan of this sort of nostalgizing, or this nostalgic take on really bad periods of one's life, or periods where it's like, when you were living it, you absolutely hated it, and yet when you grow up, you're obsessed with it. Or so this was a bill as well. Now, for Tuesday and Wednesday, I read manga, and that was great. Check out my earlier video on that. On Thursday, I decided to read try to read one of the books I had selected for June on the Range, which is a booktube event created by Michael K. Vaughan, in which participants read westerns in the month of June. And I made a video about a month ago asking for recommendations for westerns, because the westerns, the fiction I have tried, have not worked for me at all. And a commenter recommended a weird western, which is a western that has science fiction and fantasy elements, or is a science fiction or fantasy that uses western elements. For those of you who don't know, a western is a genre of historical fiction set in the American West, which would be usually west of the Mississippi, although it could also be west of the Rockies, depending upon your definition of the West, and is usually set between 1870 to the 1900s, at the later half of the 19th century, although there is some bleed over to earlier in the 19th century and into the early 20th century. Although I think there's also some westerns that extend further into the 20th century, if not even into the 21st century, although these are different kinds of westerns. Anyway, so the book I tried was A Ride by Night by Robert McCammon. It's about a vampire private detective, Trevor Lawson, who is hired to take a ransom to a town populated by vampires because a wealthy individual's daughter has been kidnapped by vampires. The book was bad. What I read of it, the writing was hideous. Absolutely hideous. There was no saving grace to it. I tried to read it on my my Kindle. I didn't want to actually buy a copy, so I bought one on Amazon. And as I was trying to read it, it didn't want to cooperate, which is why I despise e-reading. Ooh, boy, do I despise e-reading. And the cover thumbnail? not so bad. Actual on account. Oh, anyway. So I just did not like it at all. So I built on it. And that brings me to today. So I had in the back of my mind that I really should give this book a go. And that was Inventing the Renaissance by Ada Palmer. So this is a history of the myth-making about the Renaissance, as much as it is about the Renaissance itself. And I was hoping that the approach that Palmer takes in this book, which is irreverent and humorous, might work on me, and it didn't. I'm not in the mood for this. So, done with that. And so that was my disappointing reading week outside of the manga. So that probably tells me I should spend this coming reading week and probably the next one maybe ensconced more in manga than anything else. We shall see. I think I'm in a way resisting that though, because everything else has gone wrong, and so I don't really want to tempt another burnout as I experienced a few weeks ago, or about a month or so now. Anyway, so I will of course report back next week on how my reading shapes up. And I'll think about what I want to read tonight and very early in the morning. So next week, there's a tag video I want to make. I just need to figure out whether I want to pick books that I still have in my possession. Why, I don't know, but I do. Or a mix of books I have in my possession and books that I have gotten rid of. I also want to try some discussion videos, although I've been saying that for weeks now and they just don't work. So, anyway. Until I see you next week, BookTube, thank you. Have a great afternoon, evening, and weekend, and see you on Monday.